welcome everybody for to here this morning, this afternoon, wherever you may be. And really going to be talking about getting started with no code, low code applications using the Microsoft Power Platform. And just to give you a little bit of a intro who I am, my name's Nick Doleman. I am a Power Platform Dynamics 365 specialist. I'm also a Microsoft MVP since 2017, and I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer as well. I'm broadcasting to you today from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And here are some of my ways you can reach out to me. Follow me on Twitter at ReadyXRM. I do a blog primarily about the Power Platform, a lot on Power Apps portals and different things with the Power Platform, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. And some of the stuff that I do, I also post on GitHub as well for some of the code samples and things like that. So that's enough about me. You're really more here, I think, to see stuff about the Power Platform. So let's move on. So here's the agenda we're going to be following today. And we're going to be sort of looking at these 4 different areas. First off, I'm going to talk about what is the Power Platform. So for those of you who might have heard of the Power Platform but don't really know what it is, hopefully I can begin to give you a better picture of what that Power Platform is. And then I'm going to talk about 3 sort of big pillars when we're building business applications that I think are very important. And these aren't the only ways to build applications using the Power Platform, but really kind of a good robust way. So we're going to be talking about Dataverse. And Dataverse really is the kind of that data repository plus a whole bunch of other things of which we can build our business applications on top of and continue on that way. So I'll talk a lot about Dataverse, what it is, where it came from, and why it's important in the Power Platform. And I'm also going to be talking about building Power Apps. And for those of you who may have heard of Power Apps, there's different Power Apps we can build as we build our business applications, and we can build these very quickly and rapidly. And today we'll actually put together a couple different Power Apps kind of as a demonstration to work through the whole different process. So you'll be able to see how quickly you can get something up and running, and for the most part, I will not be writing much code at all, if any. So this is really showing it's a low code platform. That being said, it has a lot of extensibility points that professional developers can definitely be involved with to take that last mile or do that extensions. And then we're also going to be talking about Power Automate as a way to automate a lot of processes as we build our business applications. And we'll take a look at a couple examples and build out a few things with Power Automate. And that's sort of the third part of the day. So just want to make sure if everybody's ready to go, let's dive right in. So first question is, what is the Power Platform? And basically, when we talk about the Power Platform, it is something that is built on top of Azure. It does utilize Office 365 and some of these others. And really, I would say there's 7 big components that we talk about when we're talking about the Microsoft Power Platform. Like I said, it does integrate with Office 365, with Azure. There's Dynamics 365 in there as well, and we'll talk about how that fits into the Power Platform, plus other standalone applications. So when I look at it, like I said, there's 7 different key components. This is sometimes changing as Microsoft marketing gets involved and some of the names change, but really there's a lot of these core components. So there's Power BI, there's Power Apps, which we'll talk a lot about today. There's Power Automate that we will be discussing and looking at. There's also things like Power Virtual Agents. I won't touch on Power Virtual Agents, but this is a way to easily create chatbots for your applications, whether it's for your own team internally or whether it's for its external users as well. Talk a little bit about the data connectors, meaning, yes, I will be talking about Dataverse a lot, but we can also connect to other systems. We can connect to SharePoint, we can connect to Oracle, we can connect to Azure SQL, Salesforce, a whole bunch of other things we can connect to using those data connectors when we're building Power Apps or building flows. There also is AI Builder, and that is also kind of to use AI against the data. And of course, we will be really diving in pretty deep into Dataverse just to give you a good understanding of all the components that are involved with that. So let's just kind of drill down into each of these sort of 7 components individually and really talk about how they work together, how they're placed within the Power Platform. So the first one is Power BI. I'm not going to be going in depth into Power BI today, but what it is really a business intelligence tool where you can build reports and dashboards and different things. Now, the thing about the Power BI is it is part of the Power Platform, but it kind of sits in its own little area because we can talk to multiple different data sources. Of course, we can talk to Dataverse, but we can also talk to, like I said, Oracle databases or Dynamics or Salesforce or different data sources to bring all of this information together so you can make decisions and work towards that. With Power BI, we can embed Power Apps into Power BI. We can take Power BI dashboards and put those into Power Apps. We can put those on portals and different ways we can consume all of this data. So the other thing we'll be talking about is Power Automate. And what Power Automate is, it used to be known as Microsoft Flow, and really it is a workflow engine that spans not only the Power Platform, but ties into anywhere else like Office 365, into Azure. And it's something that was kind of built on the foundation of Azure Logic Apps. It is a way to automate a lot of things. It's a way to move bits of data. It's a way to communicate with different sources. And as we're going to see today, it's really easy to work with, and you can do a lot of things with it. I've been building Power Automate flows to do a lot of my own, like some of my own personal work, to manage a lot of the tasks that always took me a long time. I have it now automating a lot of these things. I don't even need to think about it anymore. It just sort of happens in the background using Power Automate. And we're going to be spending quite a bit of time in sort of that third hour today on Power Automate. So the other one I did mention earlier is Power Virtual Agents, and what Power Virtual Agents is that method to create chatbots. And this is something that, like I said, I won't be talking too much about today, but it is something that if you do get a chance to play with, it is really powerful that you can create those chatbots. I'm sure we've all been on the web pages where we have the little thing in the corner where we can start asking questions and getting information back. And this is a very key component in the Power Platform, not only for external users, but these can be embedded in things like Microsoft Teams to help internal users answer questions, as opposed to always like pestering somebody or having to look through knowledge articles and locate the bits of information we're looking for. And these things can be easily designed and programmed, again, using a very easy editor and kind of by dragging and dropping different aspects of the different conversations and flows and things like that. So we will be talking a lot about Power Apps. And when I talk about Power Apps within the Power Platform, Power Apps compose of 3 different types of apps. There are Canvas apps, there are model-driven apps, and there are Power Apps Portal, which are portal apps. We're going to be looking at each of these 3 as we put together a business application. So again, this is something that we will be drilling some further down in, but this is really kind of the core thing in the Power Platform to build those business solutions for your end users. The other part I do want to talk a little bit about is data connectors. And with the data connectors, Microsoft continually adds new data connectors. What these allow you to do is allow you, when you're creating Canvas apps or you're creating Power Automate flows, to connect to different services or connect to different data sources. So for example, if you wanted to take information from your CRM system, which could be sitting on Dataverse, and you wanted to pump out those contacts and bring them into MailChimp, well, it used to be very hard. You used to have to get a developer to build the APIs and the integration for that. Now, using Flow, you could connect to Dataverse, and then you could connect to MailChimp, and then put a process in place so that information moves from Dataverse to MailChimp. If there's responses, you can get it moving back, or any other type of different connector that could be available. Now, if there isn't a connector that's available in the 300 plus, like let's say you want to connect to something like QuickBooks, if you look, there is no QuickBooks connector. At least there wasn't a few days ago. And like I said, this is constantly changing. But what you could do is you could build what's called a custom connector, because something like QuickBooks has published a REST API that those are really meant for developers. But even if you're not a hardcore developer, but you're good at understanding technical things, you could build a custom connector to talk to those APIs. And then once you have that custom connector created, you could utilize that in your Power Apps and in your flows. Another component, AI Builder. So this is really cool because AI has always been one of those, science fiction-y things that are just a little bit out there. You have data scientists that might be building things in Azure using AI, and it's stuff that you sort of read about. However, AI Builder is a tool that kind of brings a lot of that technology and power down into kind of low code applications. So there's a lot of ongoing features and changes. So things such as like doing forms processing, where if you're collecting your receipts, I think, if anybody has been, we're at the end of the month, so hopefully everybody's got their taxes done. But if you have to go through and scan all your receipts and collect the data and tabulate that, you could use AI Builder to scan your receipts and pull that information, put it into a database and organize it that way a lot faster and a lot easier. It also has other things like you can read text. You could take pictures of a shelf if you're working in a warehouse and you want to do an inventory count. It will actually, if you kind of train the models to recognize your boxes or your products that are sitting on the shelf, you just have to take a picture of it, and AI Builder can process the picture and actually do a count of how much inventory is on your shelf. There's a ton of different applications that AI Builder can do, and you could basically use some of these AI Builder features directly within your Power Apps or within your Power Automate flows. So we've talked about those 7 different sort of aspects of the Power Platform. I'm going to circle back a little bit and drill down a little bit further into those Power App types. And we are going to revisit this discussion a little bit later on in sort of hour 2 of our discussion. But when I mentioned earlier, I talked about the fact that there were 3 different Power App types. There's the Canvas app from blank, or sorry, the Canvas app, there's the model-driven app, and then there's the portal. So the first off, if I'm looking at something like a Canvas app, these are really geared to be pixel perfect, where you want to put your buttons, where you want to put your different components. We're going to be looking at building a Canvas app a little bit later on, so you'll be able to see how well that works. So the benefit is with a Canvas app, we can really make this a good task-driven application for our users to make them very easy to use. One of the great features of Canvas apps is it can talk using different data sources and data connectors. So you don't necessarily have to rely on using something like Azure SQL or Dataverse. If you want to link to a SharePoint list, you could do that. If you want to use Excel, you could do that. I would recommend going with something like Dataverse because of all the robust capabilities that we'll talk about. But this is sort of one thing about the Canvas apps. It's really that great flexibility. So if you've built things in Microsoft Access before using forms, or even if you're a developer and have built applications using Visual Basic way back when and kind of built those forms out, you'll find, excuse me, working with Canvas apps really kind of easy to work with and use. So we will kind of circle back to Canvas apps, and we will sort of I'll go through a demo and we'll build one. So there is also something called model-driven apps. Now, model-driven apps are a little bit more admin side, or a little bit, excuse me, 1 second. Excuse me. So when we talk about model-driven apps kind of pull a lot from Dynamics 365, but you don't necessarily need those Dynamics 365 features. You can begin to build applications based on a data model. The benefit about this is it might not look as maybe pretty as a Canvas app, but if you're dealing with large amounts of data or different data relationships, the model-driven app is a great way to build a very functional, very easy app very quickly. It has a standard menuing system. The data is displayed typically on views and forms. It's very easy to navigate. It has a lot of built-in processing functionality. Its back end is strictly Dataverse for the most part, although you can create virtual tables, which is a whole other discussion. But basically, the model-driven apps is one way to quickly go from something like a spreadsheet to using a robust, secure kind of like industry grade business application very quickly. And we're going to again be spending quite a bit of time building out and looking at the model driven apps a little bit later on in hour 2. And then as part of the apps, there is also the portal apps. And what the portal allows you to do is the apps, the Canvas app and the model-driven app are really meant for your own internal staff to work with the data, to work with these business applications, but sometimes you want to expose some of that data or surface that to an external audience. So this is where we could use Power Apps Portals. So Power Apps Portals it's a website, pretty simple, but it also is kind of a lightweight CMS, so you can put some static content, but its true power is you can surface data that's sitting in your Dataverse that your internal users would access using a model-driven app or a Canvas app. But with the portal, we can surface that information to external audiences in a secure, private manner if we wanted to. Depending on our timing, we'll be able to spend a bit of time looking at a portal and building out a little of that functionality just so you can get an appreciation or an understanding of how the portal Power Apps can fit into the whole ecosystem as well. Now, when we talk about Power Apps and the Power Platform, a lot of times the discussion comes up of Dynamics 365. And where does Dynamics 365 fit into the whole discussion of the Power Platform? Well, it's interesting. Dynamics 365 is actually a whole collection of different applications ranging all the way from doing supply chain management to customer engagement, customer service, field service, omnichannel, marketing. There's a whole bunch of different apps. What really Dynamics 365 is, and kind of remember this, Dynamics 365 is a Power App. It is a model-driven, most of the applications are a model-driven Power App. It's built, a lot of the customer engagement side of Dynamics 365 is built on Dataverse. So when we're actually looking at a model-driven app or looking at Dynamics 365 side by side, you really can see that they're pretty much the exact same layout, the same format. And we'll talk a little bit about the history of that, of why that is. But basically, if you're looking at Dynamics 365, it's part of the Power Platform, but really it fits into the Power App. What makes it different is it's sold by Microsoft and licensed by Microsoft. So you could build your own Power Apps within your own organization. And basically within your organization, you could build your own, different apps for different things. But if you wanted to do something like customer service, Microsoft already has a Power App available to you, so you could license Dynamics 365 customer service as basically as a Power App. Now that's licensed a little bit differently, but it has all that built-in functionality for tracking cases, for having a knowledge base article, for doing channels, for doing a call center. So as opposed to you building something from ground up, you could take something Microsoft provides and basically use the same techniques that I'll show you today to extend and personalize it for your own individual needs. So yeah, this quick question come up here, and like I said, don't be shy if you have questions. There's a question is, what are the courses available for low code, no code platform, Canvas app and portal? So I would say, I'm not sure what WebAge has on their schedule, but the courses that you would look at, one is the PL 900, which is, I believe, a kind of a Power Platform fundamentals, and the PL 200, which is the Power Platform functional consultant. They cover a lot of Canvas apps and Power Apps, that functionality, and kind of can get you toward the certification for that. So hopefully that answers that question. And again, reach out to the folks at WebAge as well, and they can kind of let you know what the schedules are and that kind of thing. So that was sort of the introduction to the Power Platform. So what I want to talk about now is Dataverse. So we'll move on here. And when I talk about the Power Platform, so that's the intro here. We talked about the Power Platform. We talked about each of these 7 things. We are going to zero back in on Power Apps and Power Automate, but let's really focus on Dataverse. And the reason why I like to focus on Dataverse is it really is a foundation, a really robust foundation of putting your data somewhere where it's secure. There's a lot of extra functionality. I know a lot of people will start building applications on something like SharePoint lists or even you know, Azure SQL, which you definitely can, but Dataverse provides a lot of extra features and functionalities to really supercharge your business applications. So it's good to understand what's available there. And let's just take a little bit of a quick history of where Dataverse has come from. Some of you might not have even heard of Dataverse before. This might be a new concept to you. It's actually existed for almost 20 years, and a lot of people get surprised when they hear that. So Dataverse is up and was actually called the Common Data Service for up until like last October. So before that, it was the Common Data Service for a year or two. And where it originated from, if we go back in history, all the way back to Microsoft Business Solutions CRM version 1 way back in 2003, and it was in beta before that. It was based on SQL Server, but there was that business layer where it had a lot of custom entities already pre-configured. It had that business application logic already there, and it was what Microsoft used to build their their CRM application that they began to market and sell. So that whole thing, a lot of those concepts that exist in Dataverse today, you can still see where their history came from way back those many years ago. It originally came from Dynamics CRM. So that's why we even see some of the labeling and things like that. So it's not just a brand new version 1 thing from Microsoft that they just thought of a few months ago. It's got about 20 years of development and sort of functionality behind it, features and things like that. So it is a very robust platform. It's now sitting exclusively as an online platform. You can get an on-premise CRM still, but that's kind of taken a different diverging path. So a question that I constantly get when we talk about Dataverse, people just make this assumption that Dataverse is really just a database, when it's really not. There's much more to Dataverse than just the database aspects of it. So I have a slide that I got from Microsoft that I really like. We'll move this in here. So basically, at its core, what Dataverse is, it's an API. So an API, application programming interface. Basically, from an application, you send a request, it gives you information back, or you send it something, it does something to data, or it gives you a message back. So from this API, we can access Dataverse through a bunch of different ways. First off, I can access it through the regular Power Platform features, such as Power BI, through a Power App or Flow, or even AI Builder can look at that data in Dataverse and begin to work with it. If I want to even take it a step further, and I have developers on board, we can extend this a little further. So using those developer tools such as Visual Studio and Xamarin, some of these other tools, or even you could use non-Microsoft tools. Like I know people that have written PHP websites that talk directly to Dataverse, going through the SDKs and the APIs. So you do have that. Now, going beyond the whole database layer, you also have oops, a couple things here. We have secure. Let me just see if I can get this going right. We have security. So built in, there is a security model built directly in Dataverse. Obviously, for building business applications, that's always a very common question. Okay, how can we make this secure? How can we only allow the right users to see it? So there is this whole authentication and authorization mechanism built in with Azure Active Directory to only allow certain users to have access to effectively that API and have that effectively to Dataverse. And we're going to be diving in and looking at a lot of these other aspects. There's built-in logic as well, meaning a lot of the things that we might want to have automated, we can actually build logic like calculated rollup fields, there's business rules, there's duplicate detection. We can extend this further with things like plugins. Dataverse has a built-in workflow engine that still is pretty robust, even though we can use Power Automate for a lot of the automation. Definitely the classic workflows is something that still is something very usable. And of course, there is, even though I say it's much more than a database, it of course is storing data. It is storing that in different things, but we can work with the different catalogs. There's a whole modeling aspect there that we can create tables within our system. We can report off that. There's data validation. And there also is something called the common data model, which I'll dive into a little bit in a few slides about basically being a template and kind of providing those industry standards, that foundation to build your business applications. There also, of course, is the storage. So at the end of the day, does Dataverse exist as kind of its own data store? Well, it doesn't, because it actually uses a lot of existing Microsoft technology, such as Azure SQL, uses Azure Blob storage. You can tie a lot of this information into an Azure data lake as well. So that storage, that kind of it's adding that easier to access layer, but behind the scenes, it is using standard storage technology. So it really isn't kind of a new concept that way. And then finally, we have integration as well. So we're not just living in that silo using webhooks, using other events, using data export tools. We can work with other databases and other systems. So I think of something like Dynamics 365 supply chain management, that because there's a whole history behind that product as well. It came from something called Exapta or Dynamics AX. It is still sitting kind of in its own SQL-based data platform that's a little bit different from Dataverse. However, there now is the concept of dual write. So it's becoming more and more merged as we go, and we can use Dataverse to talk to these different data sources. So I'm going to kind of go through and click through these aspects a little bit deeper. So we have that Dataverse API. And like I said, we can use this to connect our Power Apps directly to Dataverse. There's some built-in connectors, of course, like with Power Automate and Canvas app, we can immediately start to work directly with Dataverse. Now, there also is the Dataverse SQL endpoint. So for those of you who still like using SQL Server Query Analyzer, you can connect to Dataverse using that tool from read-only purposes. You can't do inserts or updates at this time, but you can access it through using that T-SQL language. If we're building a model-driven app or we're building a portal, Dataverse is the default data store for those particular Power Apps. It is the default for Canvas apps, but again, like I mentioned, Canvas apps can use different types of connectors. Question here, what about different cloud technology providers? So something like, I think probably like think of like Azure Web Services or Oracle or something like that. Yes, you can. So in this case, we're building on top of Dataverse, but we could build Power Apps or Flow to talk to some of these other services as well, as long as they have a proper REST API. So you could integrate with Dataverse, but at the end of the day, your data would still be stored in Dataverse, but you could definitely integrate with a different cloud provider data store. Hopefully that answers the question. So going through here, when we talk about I did want to mention again, I am going to be circling back to the model-driven Power Apps. And really, this sort of, like I said, it's a little bit separate. As part of the Dataverse talk, a model-driven app has the forms, the views, the default navigation, as I mentioned. It has default functionality for searching, for exporting. We have the different controls. And again, this is built on Dynamics 365, but as a front-end application for Dataverse, the model-driven apps are sort of that default way to access that Dataverse data. And we will talk more about that. Now, when we look at the connectors, and I talked earlier about the different connectors that are available when we're building Power Automate flows or we're building Canvas apps, and we look through that list of 300 plus connectors, you would probably think, well, there's probably just one single Dataverse connector. There isn't. There's actually, today, there's 3 that you might run into. I know it adds a level of confusion, but again, Microsoft, and don't get me wrong, I love working with Microsoft. I love working with Microsoft technologies. However, there's different groups creating different things at different times. So you might see the Dynamics 365 connector. So if you're already working with Dynamics 365, you might think, oh, I want to build a flow that talks to that, or I want to build a Canvas app. You might think, I'm just going to use the Dynamics 365 connector. You could, but it has now been deprecated. I think there's going to be a certain point where it's not going to be available. It will still be usable. It was originally designed to connect to Dynamics 365 customer engagement apps, but you really should be using one of the Dataverse connectors instead. So it's there, but it's sort of deprecated. If I go to the center, the Dataverse connector, and these were recently renamed from the Common Data Service. So if you're, again, wondering where these came from, if you built any kind of flow or Canvas app already and you're using the Common Data Service connectors, if you were to go back in and take a look today, chances are that you will see that they have been renamed to Dataverse. So just be aware of that. But with the Dataverse connector, we need to specify the environment that we're talking to. And we'll talk a little bit more about environments a little bit later on. But this way, using that connector, we can talk to different environments. We can move data and information from one Dataverse environment to another. And we can also use it within our model-driven apps to kind of run on-demand flows using this connector as a trigger. It's still useful, but chances are if you're building brand new apps, and probably what we'll be utilizing today for the most part is the most recent, and it's called the Dataverse current environment, meaning it's going to by default use the current environment where you're building your apps. And when I say environment, think of sort of databases or different tenants, and that's kind of encapsulates different types of organizations or different types. You might have a dev environment, you might have a prod environment and a test environment. And this is where those connectors would work. So you'd have, you would use the environment where it sits. There's a lot more actions. So when I talk about connectors, they have actions involved or different things you can do. The Dataverse current environment has a lot more of those links there, different things they could do. However, we can't do that on-demand run from a model-driven app. So that's why I sometimes have to revert back to that Dataverse connector in the center to do some of those tasks. I would say eventually we're going to be seeing, I would say if I did this talk again, maybe 1 year from now, probably I'd remove this slide and there'll only be one particular Dataverse connector at that time. But like everything with Microsoft, things evolve over time and they merge and deprecate and add new things. As I mentioned before, a brand new, I say brand new, it's been out just for a few months now. If you're one of these folks that love using SQL T-SQL statements, and I totally hear you, it's very comfortable for me. I did SQL way years ago. You can still query the Dataverse using that SQL connector. It's really read only, so I can only do select statements. But typically this is used for Power BI if you want to have more of a persistent connection, or if you're doing something in pure custom development. This, I assume, will also evolve over time. But again, just sort of be aware that you can, use the connector to connect to do those SQL statements. Another great question, Dataverse can store different type of document attachment like PDF doc and things like that. Yeah, it can. Couple different ways it can do that. You can, and I'll try to remember to show you when we get into that, but you can store an attachment like a PDF document or an Excel document. You can attach that directly to a record. So if you have a contact record and you want to like attach the resume, you can attach it to that record. Or there is within Dataverse a file field type that you could have on your model-driven app, a field that you can do a lookup to a file and attach it that way. And then what happens is it takes that file, and from the front end, you don't notice any difference, but it stores it in Azure Blob on the back end. So the short answer was yes. I gave you a little bit longer answer. So yeah, you can definitely store pretty much any kind of file within Dataverse. And when I talk about Dataverse, again, in Canvas apps, there are connectors, like I talked about the connectors before. With those connectors, we can connect to Power Automate and Canvas apps. It's automatic. If I start a brand new Canvas app, automatically I can connect to the Dataverse database. And that's in the Canvas apps. And if it's model driven in portals, and if it's also Dynamics 365, those customer engagement apps, that is it's using Dataverse in the back. We talked about the Dataverse web API. So again, if you get to a point where you have some business functionality that you can't use, you kind of hit your limit with Power Automate, you can't do it with the built-in workflows, the business rules, you always can create things like a plugin using C#, .NET to build out these things in a variety. You can create a plugin and talk to the Dataverse web API. Not only that, with these plugins, but you could also build things like Azure functions or different things to talk to the Azure the Dataverse web API as well. So this really expands, really at the end of the day, sky's the limit of what you can build, because you don't necessarily have to rely on the out-of-the-box configuration tools. Granted, there's a lot you can do, and a lot of the projects that I've worked on over the years had no custom development whatsoever, but probably a lot of the bigger projects especially had maybe a small portion of custom dev, but for the most part, it was all configured using low-code tools. And again, it doesn't have to be Microsoft technology. Like I said, if you have any kind of other language like PHP, for example, that can talk to web APIs using REST calls and things like that, you could utilize those. So next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is security. Security is also a very big discussion when we're building business applications. So there is a security at the platform level within Dataverse. Really, in terms of authentication, it is tied to Microsoft 365 users or Office 365 users. They would be assigned a security role. Now, typically what we would have normally have always done is added the security role directly within a Dataverse. There are ways we can go in the configuration into the admin center and assign users to roles. However, just recently, Microsoft has added some additional functionality that you can do much more of that management directly in Azure AD. I don't really have an example of that today, but this is where your IT, if they're setting up a brand new user in Microsoft 365, they can take those users, assign those to specific groups. Purely by assigning those to specific groups, if they're tied to security roles within Dataverse, then they have access to those applications and data based on the groups that they're added in Azure AD. Now, that still, when we get down to the Dataverse side, security is a little bit different than just giving people access to files and folders and permissions in Azure AD. You do need to specify the security in those roles on the Dataverse side, because they'll be more on a table by table basis or even on a column basis. And you can set different permissions and different privileges like create, read, delete, attach, append to, things like that. And you can begin to kind of make a very granular data structure or security level on a row by row basis, as well as a column basis. So there is what was called field level security. Microsoft does tend to rename things. So this is actually now, I think, officially called column level security. But what this allows you to do is actually put security on individual attributes or columns within your Dataverse data structure. So you can really get that fine tuning. So for things like for HR, if you want to hide salary or that kind of stuff, you could hide that salary field that other users would just see, kind of like a password field, just those like asterisks, as opposed to seeing that data, or they can create it, but they can't read it, and different things like that. There also is the ability to do data auditing. So what that means is if something has changed over time, or you realize, oh, some data went missing or something changed, really we want to find out whose fault is it, who did it, who screwed it up. With data auditing, this is something you can turn on, and then it can track those changes by who made the change and when did they make the change. A couple things with data storage, it is tracked separately. So if you have a certain amount of allocation in your cloud for building Power Apps and Dataverse and things like that, the audit storage is measured a little bit differently. So it's not as expensive as just using pure database storage. I will say that one thing though, the reporting is a little bit awkward to extract that. You have good visibility, but if you wanted to have this in a certain format, a certain way, it's definitely doable, but there's some awkwardness there. The other thing though is you probably also don't want to turn on, you can basically determine what tables and what fields you want to turn auditing on for. You don't necessarily want to turn it on for your entire database because you could really bog down with a lot of extra logs and potentially some performance issues as well. So just be aware of that. I like to turn on data auditing for those mission critical things that people really want to have to keep track of in the event that they kind of need to go and kind of reverse find what's been done and when. Next thing I want to talk about is what we call Dataverse logic. So yes, we can build Power Automate flows. We can build some plugins using C# and calling the web API or from other languages, but there are some built-in tools directly into Dataverse that allow us to do some kind of on-the-fly logic. And some examples of that are things like calculated and roll-up fields. So I can create a calculated field. We did talk about plugins. There are also what I call the classic workflows, which is that workflow engine built in Dataverse. There's business rules, which can do things like hide and show different forms and fields, or basically make data required if this other piece of data is above a certain threshold level and that kind of thing. We can also do scheduled jobs, for instance, like a bulk delete if we want to remove or archive historical data over time. And it also has built-in things like duplicate detection. So you can set the duplicate detection rules. As soon as you add another contact to your Dataverse, there'd be a pop-up window that says, this person has the same email address as this person. Are you sure you want to create this record? Those are pieces of that logical functionality that are built directly into that platform. So for example, if we have something like the calculated and roll-up fields, these are things that they don't actually store the data, but they do show the result of those calculations. We also have those roll-up fields, which are an aggregate of like child records, and they could show like the sum or account of different data things. And we can configure that within the Dataverse to do those calculations. So this saves you from getting a developer to write a plugin to do some of these calculations or writing some JavaScript. This is something that's built in. There is an editor here. It's all point and click. You can go in and begin to build and add and merge these things together. I did talk a little bit already about plugins. Again, if we want to, extend the code a little bit further, we can have developers write that C# code and perform actions on the Dataverse record, calculations, create records, trigger processes, even talk to external systems. And this is something that you can determine whether you run asynchronously or synchronously. And because it's all code, you have a finite amount of control. However, and with these plugins as well, they're great, but again, this is when we kind of get to that extreme. So this is probably, when I'm talking low code, this goes beyond, really at the end of the day, we can do a lot of stuff with the low code, but if we can't, pro code or that high code is still available to us as an option. Talked a little about business rules. Business rules are really just short little actions to make a change on the user interface or certain rules within data. This was kind of originally designed to be sort of a way around writing JavaScript on the client side. It is kind of point and click. It's a pretty easy tool to work with. We won't talk too much about it today, but again, there's more of that logic where we don't need high code or JavaScript code written to do certain things when we're building our business applications. And there's other built-in logic things already within Dataverse. There is the classic workflows. Now, if you're building those classic workflows, if you go into the user interface, you might actually see a little pop-up that says, hey, there's Power Automate, you should use that. And for sure, there's probably most cases where I would have written a workflow a few years ago, I will use Power Automate now. However, there are still a few key business items that are still better implemented using this workflow engine that's built in Dataverse, particularly if you want it to run synchronously, meaning you want it to run with, a user does something, you want that workflow to run before they can do anything else. With flow being asynchronous, you kind of kick it off and let it run in the background. With workflow, it is sort of instantaneous. So despite what you may have heard, workflows are not going away. They're not being deprecated. They're probably going to be more enhanced to do the things that flow can't do. There also is business process flows. And again, this is more of a user interface type thing where it can guide users using a model-driven app to enter data in a certain sequence, and based on how they enter it can do some branching and some different logic there. There's also jobs to we can delete records on a schedule or do some other kind of updates. And again, we have that duplicate detection. So we have those kind of different built-in logic directly within Dataverse. So when we talk about Dataverse data, what exactly do you mean? Now we're kind of getting to that core where Dataverse is like a database. So very much it is, because the back end is Azure SQL. It has that concept of, tables, or used to be called entities, but now they're called tables. Used to be called fields, now they're called columns. They have that, there are a relational database, so you can do a one-to-many, a many-to-one, or a many-to-many. And a lot of these are based on something called a common data model. So if you're building a business application, and as the one I'll show you a little bit in the demo side, you don't necessarily need to create these tables from scratch. A lot of them might already exist in the common data model, so we can reutilize those. The benefit of that is if someone else were to create an application that talked to the same Dataverse, they don't need to reinvent the wheel either, and you guys are all kind of going to be on the same page in terms of the data structure and things like that. So definitely there's a lot more we can do, and we'll definitely drill down into this. So within the Dataverse as well, we can create those tables, and those tables or entities typically represent a real world object. So if I think of a person, there's already a contact table that we could use. Maybe I want to create something that manages projects. Well, then I can create a project table. The example that I'm going to show you a little bit later, I've built an application that manages courses and classes. So as opposed to creating from there, I've created those course and class tables. Now, a lot of this I mentioned earlier, and I talk about Dataverse, about the common data model. This is something you can find on GitHub. This is maybe it's kind of hard to see, but it's a poster. What this shows is a listing of those those out of the box tables that exist. And it's a standard that represents those real world objects. And a lot of this has been built following industry standards or best practices. So for instance, you could have things like accounts and contacts. Those are part of the core Dataverse. If you were using some of the Dynamics 365 apps like customer service, then you could have things like cases and knowledge base articles. As you install those apps, you'll have other tables from that common data model as part of your Dataverse. Of course, you can still create your own tables, and I definitely continue to do that. And then if there are other apps or industry accelerators, for instance, Microsoft has the Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare. They have a whole common data model based on some of the industry standards around healthcare applications. They've replicated that in the common data model. So if you're building healthcare based applications, you don't have to reinvent the wheel there either. You could apply that common data model directly to your Dataverse to have access to those different types of tables following that standard structure. So a lot of times, if I'm building a business application or building a Power App, the question is, okay, what can we do? What about reports? We need to get reports out of our system. There is built directly into Dataverse is a SQL Server reporting services, so SSRS. That's sort of a throwback to from Dynamics CRM. So you could still build SSRS reports and link those directly to Dataverse and load those to be accessible from a model-driven app. Within the model-driven app, you can create charts and dashboards, and I'll show you a little bit of that. When we build our model-driven app, we'll add a chart actually to one of the tables, so you'll be able to see how that works. And then, of course, if you want that high level, because this is all part of the Power Platform, there is that integration into Power BI, so you can build Power BI dashboards and reports that pull the data directly from Dataverse. So when we talk about Dataverse storage, how that data is actually physically stored, because that's a question that comes up. Is it just stored as a flat file, some CSV somewhere? It actually mostly sits on Azure SQL. That's the back end of Dataverse, but it also has linkages into Azure Blob Storage. So when we go back to the question from before about file attachments, they'll actually not use database space. They'll actually be redirected to Azure Blob with a pointer back through Azure SQL to the Dataverse table. For doing further analytics and things like that, we can move data into Azure Data Lake. There's some definitely different options there for analyzing large amounts of data. And when you create a Dataverse, you can also monitor their storage. So if you have once you license to get some Power Apps licenses, which give you some access to the Power Platform, you are allocated a certain amount of data of capacity, where as long as you stay within those capacity limits, you can create multiple Dataverse environments. Or if you need more capacity, you can always, through your subscription, add more capacity as well. And then when I'm talking about with Dataverse integration as well, we can use the different data points and have data transfer to different systems using different methods. So there's different data operations there. There's things called virtual tables and things like different integration services that we can move data across to different parts of the Dataverse. So another question is, what about third-party component supported Power App, Canvas apps, or model-driven apps, like a grid control? Oh, okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you want to have a different kind of user interface control so I'll find the link and put that in the presentation. You'll have access to this deck after. I'll try to add the link into the common data model so you can find that on GitHub. In terms of third-party components, that when we get to the model-driven apps, there is something called Power Apps Component Framework where you can build your own controls, and there are also controls available in the community. I've actually not seen anything for sale yet. Everything that the community's been doing has been for free. So if there is something specific you're looking for, like a calendar control or a certain slider or a certain dial, that might already exist. And I'll remember when we get to that, I'll point that out. So when we talk about, that's sort of the high level data integration. We also have other Dataverse integration in terms of Office 365. So for example, within a model-driven app, by default, you have that ability to export to Excel, export to Word, and do that integration. There also is an integration with Exchange. So if you want to send an email directly from within your Dataverse application, there is a way to set up an integration to your Exchange online. And of course, there also is a tie-in to Outlook. So you can add the add-in to Outlook and begin to track your emails against your contacts. or against different records within your Dataverse using that Outlook integration. And that also is a feature that was originally in Dynamic CRM that's now available to your regular Dataverse Power Apps. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Power Apps in general. So this PowerPoint is going to be a lot shorter than the one before because again, I'd rather show you than tell you about all of this stuff. So when we talk about Power Apps, first off, I just want to get, again, a confirmation that everybody can see my screen all right and hear me okay. Should just say introduction to Power Apps. Just whether in the question or the chat window, just let me know yes or no. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. So let's talk about the Power Apps. So what can it do for you? It is a low code, no code platform for building apps. Now that doesn't mean it's exclusively low code, no code, but you can build apps just using low or no code techniques. You can work with the data where it lives, so you don't need to actually bring data over somewhere else or import it into your app to work with it. It can connect to your data source like Dataverse and begin to work with it directly there. When we talk about the types of Power Apps, there's the Canvas apps where we can build from a blank canvas. There's the model-driven apps where we can build the data from Dataverse, or what formerly was known as the Common Data Service. And portals is where we could have this externally facing websites. And then of course, using things like AI Builder, we could actually tie that directly into our apps and utilize that. Won't really get a chance to use that today, but again, that is something as you build and expand out your own apps, you have that option to use AI Builder. So when I talk about Canvas apps, that's great if you want to start from a completely blank screen and your layout has to be exactly perfect how you want it, where you want your buttons, what colors you want, how you want your layout. And it's also pretty well optimized for using tablets or mobile phones. Definitely you could run it on the desktop, and I've built Canvas apps that run on the desktop as well. And you start to build this out. And then you can interact with the data using different sources. So we could connect to Dataverse, obviously, but we could connect to different sources in our Canvas app and even multiple sources at the same time. It is using, in terms of a low code language, it is using formulas that are very similar to Excel. It was actually just a couple of weeks ago that Microsoft finally gave this formula, a language, a name. So it's now known as Power Effects. So you might have seen some announcements from Microsoft, and Power Effects is really that formula-based language that sort of is based on Excel, but we're going to be able to see Power Effects in more places than just Canvas apps. You'll probably begin to see it in a lot of other places within the Power Platform. Still very new. And again, Microsoft is continually updating things, and this technology is evolving. So along with the Canvas apps, and we'll actually go and build one a little bit later, we also have model-driven apps. And the model-driven apps are built on data from the common or from the Dataverse. And there you have this functional app that works really well, that's very consistent. So I've always said, once you've seen one model-driven app, you've seen them all because they follow the same pattern of the menuing down the side, the options across the top. We have the forms and the views. And then you have to define the views, the forms, relationships, and how that data works. And again, without writing any kind of code at all. And then the other type of app is portals. And really, again, that's just surfacing that Dataverse information to an external audience. So your external stakeholders, your members, your customers can interact with the Dataverse data directly. So as opposed to, like I said, about talking about a lot of different things, what I want to do is we're going to build some Power Apps or go through the process of building some of those Power Apps. And I'm going to use today for the apps that I'm going to be building, I'm going to be using Dataverse as the foundation for these apps. However, like I said, for Canvas apps especially, you could use multiple other data sources. If you wanted to surface information in a model-driven app, there are techniques called virtual entities where you could create effectively Dataverse tables that point to external applications. That's going in a much deeper, and that's much more of a developer topic. but that is something if you did need to pull data from another system. We'll build a Canvas app, we'll build a model-driven app, and we'll build a portal. So I'll probably start with the model-driven app and then go on from there and build a Canvas app and also a portal. So when I'm looking at a model-driven app, what we want to do in today's scenario is we want to design and build an app to manage classroom data. So this is actually kind of relates back to a project I did probably about 8 or 9 years ago, where there was an organization that sold a lot of training outside of technology. So it wasn't WebAge, it was another organization, and they had a lot of courses, they had a lot of classes. And we built a solution at that time on top of Dynamics CRM, which we call an XRM solution. But again, if I were to redo that today, a lot of those lessons learned basically following the same concept to build this within a model-driven app. So when I start to build a model-driven app, typically what I'll do is I'll start to draw the data model. Now, I generated this data model using Power BI just because it gives me a nice, clean look to it. However, I could have used Visio, or probably most of the time I would just use my whiteboard and start drawing boxes and lines and things like that to try to figure how are we going to organize the data? How are we going to, what makes the most sense? What information do we have to store within that? And the other consideration that I will do is what exists already in the common data model that might fit what I want to do with my application. So when we look at something like a classroom app, I want to hold companies information like customers' company information. I also want to hold contacts, whether they're students, whether they're instructors, whether they're other stakeholders that are involved in the process. And then I also want to hold information to track courses, track classes, and registrations. So if I look at the common data model, I'll find that out of the box exists the account and contact entities. That's great. These tables exist. So things like, the account name, the address information, it's already defined. I don't need to create this table because it already exists. Now, if there was extra columns that I needed to add to make this a little bit more robust to my application, no problem. I can extend the existing tables by adding my own columns, not a problem. Same thing with the contact, it already exists. Things like first name, last name, email address, phone number, all of those columns are already part of that table. If I wanted to add another column, so like say instructor credentials or number of classes taught, I can add that column and extend that table. Very easy to do, and we'll show you how you can do that. And but then the other ones, course, class, registration, I took a look and there really wasn't anything there. So, okay, not a problem. I can go in and create those tables directly in the system. So I'm going to just exit out of my PowerPoint here. I'm going to go into my Power Platform, my make.powerapps.com. Now, before we dive into that, a lot of questions are probably coming up saying, how do we get Power Platform? How can we try it out? You can definitely spin up a trial of Power Platform. You can go to Microsoft and you can get a trial instance, or you can do a trial run and create an environment and build from that. There also is the community edition. So if I go into, I'm a big Google user, so and look at the Power Platform community plan, as long as you have an Office 365 tenant, then what you can do is sign up for the free community plan. So this is not for production use, but if you're just learning about the Power Platform and you want to try different things out, you want to build some apps, you want to build some flows, you can get this free environment to do your learning and your training on. And what I'll do is, just so you have access to that, I'll just copy that URL. I'll throw that into the chat window just so it's there. So with that, hopefully that hyperlink shows up, so that where you could actually go in and you can try some of the stuff that I'll be showing you. Now, the other thing though is I'll actually start, I'm gonna go into the Power Platform Admin Center. And and again, all of this stuff I'm showing you is 100% cloud-based technology. So I've not downloaded or installed anything on my system directly. I'm accessing this all completely from the web. So I'm in the Power Platform Admin Center. I already have a bunch of environments set up. But once I have either the licensing or I have a trial set up, I can begin to create environments. So I'm going to create a new environment, and I can call this anything I want. I'll just sort of call this web page test, and what type of environment it is. So again, if we have like things like a development environment, a testing environment, I probably would make that sandbox, or I could do a production environment, which means with the production, I'm getting a few extra features, but this needs to be robust and backed up and different things like that. So again, backups are happening all automatically. I don't need to worry about that. I don't need to worry about installing any software on a server. It's all taken care of me because it's all in the cloud. So I'm just going to pick a sandbox here. I'm going to choose the region, so what data center it's going to be installed in. And again, if you are in Australia, we'll pick the Oceanic data center. If you're in Europe, pick the European data center. Being in Canada, I'm going to pick the Canadian one. And then I'm going to create a database for this environment. Yes, this is what will create the Dataverse environment for me. I'm going to hit next. And then I have a few other options as well before I finally go through. I can choose the language. Dataverse is multilingual if I've not mentioned that before. I can pick a custom URL. I can pick which currency. It has built-in currency functionality. And we also have the ability to enable Dynamics 365 apps. So if you have the licensing for Dynamics 365, when you're provisioning your Dataverse, you can actually enable those as well. So if I turn that on, I can enable things like customer service or field service or project operations. Some of these other ones, I'm going to leave those off for now because they tend to eat up a lot of space and I don't really need them because I don't need that functionality for my app. I can restrict access using security groups. And then when I kick this off, basically it's going to go through and it's going to basically begin to provision that Dataverse environment for me. So that's going to be running in the background. Again, that's all it took. I just went through and created that environment. Now I have a list of environments already here I created earlier. So let's just take a look at this web page environment that I created. So where I'm going to go next is I was in admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. I'm now going to something called the Power Apps Maker portal. And I typically would go there using make.powerapps.com. Today I'm going to use make.preview. If you use preview within the URL, that gives you access to some of the new features within the Power Platform that you can try out, particularly the solution preview. And we'll talk a little bit more about solutions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the size of this just so it's a little bit easier for you to view. So I'm in my environment. I've chosen my web page environment, and the other one is provisioning. So I can switch environments. I can work in my test environment, work in my dev environment, and then begin to move things over. The Power Platform is ALM friendly. There are Azure DevOps build tasks that you can utilize to move your customizations from one Power Platform to another. Goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But I just, again, want to make you aware that if you are going down this road of building business applications, there are ways to create a healthy application lifecycle management environment, a way to move this stuff and be able to use source control and all those wonderful things that the pro developers use. So in here, if we're going to build applications, typically what we would use is something called a solution. A solution, think of a solution kind of as a bucket, as a way to hold all of your changes and everything in one spot. So I've already created a classroom solution. I'm going to sort that. So I have this solution called Classroom App. If I wanted to, I could go in here and create a brand new solution, but I've created one here already. So I'm going to open that up. And what this solution will hold are all those custom assets that I'll be creating as I build my application. So this is very much like a cooking show. I've already prepared a lot of this stuff for you just to keep things moving along. But remember earlier, I had that diagram where I built out the different tables that I wanted to use. And I recognized that some of these tables existed in the common data model, some I had to create. So if I go here in my tables section, see here I have account, class, contact, course. I've added a feedback one in registration. So if I wanted to pull in a table from the common data model into my solution, all I would do, instead of, I could create a new one or I can add an existing one. So I went into here and I went into add an existing table. And what this does, it shows me all of the tables that are part of the common data model, or maybe ones that I've created in other solutions as well. So it goes through a whole bunch. I have a bunch of ones created with, the sample application and whatnot. So I've already pulled in something like the account. Let's say I wanted to add donations. Well, here there's part of the sample data. There's a sample donation table. Maybe I want to reuse that. Maybe there's activities. So let's pull in, I'll pull in the, I think there's an activity here. I'm going to pull, I could pull in that particular table. And then from that table, it might have its own forms, its own views. So I might want to extend and change some of those. So I can begin to choose which of those sub assets or those sub components I want part of my solution. So maybe I want to bring in some of the forms or views. Let me see the views here. I want to bring in and modify the all activities view. So I've added this. So now it's adding these components to my solution. So I have the ability within my solution to extend and modify those. Like I said, I already brought in account and course and contact. Maybe I want to change the look and feel of how the account form will look or the view would look. So I will go into something like account here, and let's actually add a column. So we're extending an existing table within our Dataverse. Now, remember, it already had a bunch of columns. Now, I didn't bring those columns into my solution. I know they still exist. So as I build out my application, I'll be able to utilize those. But because that's part of the common data model, they're going to already exist in whatever destination environment. So here I want to add a column, and let's just sort of say we want to do what is their certifications for training. And I can call that column whatever I want. It's going to give it a schema name. I can choose my different data types, whether it's text or a number or a date or option sets or currencies. There's a whole bunch of different things here. There's also file as well and different things. I'm just going to leave it as text, keep it simple. Is this going to be a required field, or is this going to be an optional field? Is it going to be searchable? Is it a calculated or roll-up field? Again, I want to put in a description, not necessarily, it's always good to document your work. I find it's good for future me because I might be working on this application 6 months from now, and I might have completely, totally forgotten what I was working on, but at least I've put a description so I can say this field will hold certification information. And I might even go so far as if I have a work item in Azure DevOps and kind of tie it up this way, or put in some description here, just so again, I'd be able to see that. There's other advanced options if I want to enable the column security, if I want to enable auditing, what the length is, if I want to choose the IME mode for some of those other non-regular alphanumeric languages. I'm just going to hit done here, and it's going to put that column. I'm going to hit save table. And so what's happening in the background now, it's creating that table way back in the Azure SQL database. It's adding that other metadata along the way. And now I have this column that's part of my solution, which is my own custom column for the account table, which came from the common data model. So maybe I want to do further extension. So let's look at the forms. And here I might want to design an existing form. So I didn't bring in the forms, not a problem. What I can do is I can click on that add subcomponents, and I want to modify one of the out of the box forms that exists for the account. I'm just going to choose the top one off the list here, the account form. And what that's going to do is bring in that form and go back here. And let's go in and modify the form. And like I said, this is the clouds, and I also am running GoToMeeting. So it probably is slowing my system down just a little bit, but now what's coming up is the form designer. So I have this form designer, which is a what you see is what you get designer. And I can organize this a little bit, so like my timeline, and I already have some different sections and tabs and things, which is going to be the basis of my model-driven app. And like I said, model-driven apps follow a certain pattern, although that still gives me a lot of flexibility as I'm adding different fields and forms. So I can go to my fields here in the properties window, and I want to choose, I just want to see the custom ones that I created. So here's that certification for training field, and I'm just going to drag that and add it directly to the form under parent account. So now this appears here. Again, this is a text field, so that's not a big deal. But if I wanted it to show a certain format, and there's a question earlier about custom controls and things like that, or third-party controls. Um, there are ways I can change this by adding a particular component. So here I could put in something like a rich text editor control. Now these components sort of exist out of the box. There's also a business card scanner. I can embed a Canvas app. That's a whole other discussion. But if I wanted to add some custom controls here, because I wanted to have like a certain view or a certain way to interact with that piece of data, what I can do is I can either create my own control using TypeScript, I think, and React. Or if you're not a developer, there is a website called PCF Gallery. And what this is a place where you can download a whole bunch of different controls that you can use when you're building either your model driven or your Canvas apps. So here we see here's a tree component. There's a two options console. There's so different things here. So if you're into, want to make a different interface on specific things, this is an option. I'll throw this link in the chat window as well. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. But for now, let's just sort of stick to the plan. I'm going to go back here, and I've added this. And then once I've done, I can just save and I can publish my form. So I published my form here. I've added that certification for training. I didn't add any special controls to it. That's okay at this point. I can go back, and the other thing I can do as well is begin to modify. I can modify other forms, and we can embed things like there's quick views and embedded view forms and different things like that. The other thing I have is the views themselves, which is that list. I have active accounts. I'm going to go in to modify that particular view. And here we see I can change the width. And again, I'm going to go into very similar to the forum designer. Although this is a view, so we see multiple records. And I'm just going to add this column into my view here. Now there's no data in it yet, so it shows up blank. And then once I'm done here, I can save this and publish that. So creating the forms and views is probably the biggest job when you're creating your model-driven apps, but notice how a lot of these forms, especially for the common data model entities or tables, already have a set of forms and views that are available to you. If I look at one of my tables that I created myself, let's say for the class, for example, and I looked at the forms here, it does give you the bare bones information when you're creating that, but at least you have a starting point, and then you would just go through and begin to add whatever fields or columns that you want to your particular form. So I'm just going to give this a second to come up. So same thing here. I've actually have an embedded form. I have my different fields here, and I have an embedded grid. So there's a bit of work that I put in when I'm designing this form. So I would go through this for each of my tables. I would create the views, I would create the forms and all of that stuff. The other thing I can do as well is, so once I have the basics of these forms and views, the next thing I want to do is build my app. So I've already created an app here, but let's look under the apps within my solution. So I've created this classroom app. You can tell it's a model-driven app. And I'm going to go into the editor here. And this is the app designer. And this looks a little strange, but it will all make sense shortly. So here in the app designer, when it loads up, we're in the app designer, we have a site map. We have a listing of the entities that are included in our app. So we see things like the account, the class, contact, the course. We can choose what forms that we created we want to use, what views. I will talk a little bit about charts and dashboards as well. So these entities or these tables are part of my app. Now, how I want that to look in terms of a design, I want to go into my sitemap. So in my sitemap, I've divided out my sections into stakeholders. So I have my accounts and contacts, they're already here. I have another section called Classroom, where I have my listing of courses, my classes, my registrations, and also where I store feedback. And I have my admin, where I have the different currencies I might want to set up and manage. And if I wanted, I could go through and edit this. I could move some things around. I could add additional tables to view in this. Now, let's actually take a look what this looks like. So remember, I created my tables. I created my forms, I created my views. Also note that with the tables, one thing I didn't really touch on was there are relationships between the tables. So remember when I had my diagram where I had the one to many and many to one, those I would define as well when I'm building my when I'm building out my tables. So I'm done with my app, but if I go into my tables here, if I look at class, I have relationships here. And that's a key thing to remember. I should have pointed that out sooner, but this is where I can define my relationships between other tables. So I have my class, it's related to a registration because a registration can link to a class. And we have one to many, meaning one registration can link, or sorry, one class can have many registrations. Here's the course. I am linking many, course can have many classes. So we have those linkages created through the relationships as we're designing our tables. So in this case, I've already got my tables created. I've already got my relationships. I have my forms, I have my views, and I've also built out my app as well. So now that I have my app built, and what I would typically do, and once I've done all this work, I would publish all my customizations, and then I would go back to my solutions here, and I have my listing of apps, and I have my classroom app. I've also gone in and updated the icons, and again, that's definitely something you can do. So I'm going to run my classroom app now. And because it's a model-driven app, it looks extremely similar to any other model-driven app. So there's a lot of things I didn't need to worry about configuring. So here we go. We've loaded my model-driven app. I have the side panels. Remember, we're designing the sitemap. We had accounts and contacts as its own area. In the stakeholders, we also have our classroom area. So I can click on this, and I have my courses, I have my classes, and it shows a list of all of this information and the registration. So we can see that the format of this app follows a very similar pattern. Also notice, I did not write one single line of code. No code was written in the development of this app, yet we have this fully functioning application. I can drill down and look at a particular course, or a particular class rather. Um, Find things like what classes are related to it, what the cost is, what the status reason is, what the description is. If I wanted to, I can create a new record. I can deactivate this. I can email a link. I could trigger a flow. I didn't have to configure any of these things. They're just there. If I wanted to limit this, I could limit it through security roles if I didn't want people to have delete access. Believe me, that is the first thing I remove on every app for the average user. I would configure that within the security role. I don't need to do any kind of programming to remove this. The save, and close. If I wanted to navigate here, we have, actually, let me just open up one of these. I have the ability to navigate through the different apps on the side. Again, that's just out of the box. It's just there. And I can go through and navigate through each of these individual classes from this point of view, very much if I had built this in Access or anything like that. So I didn't have to draw anything on the screen. I didn't have to configure anything. It's just sort of there in the box. So that's one of the big features of a model-driven app. And again, we could do a lot more to extend this. We can extend this with JavaScript. We can do business rules to hide and show different fields. I could do JavaScript to do some other specialized calculations. Of course, from this as well, I can do mail merges. I have the ability to export this out to Excel if I wanted. I could open this in Excel online. There's just a ton of features that sort of come out of the box with a model-driven app. And probably in terms of time to build this, I probably spent a ton of time designing, but less time, configuring the table, the field, the views, and things like that. I could take this to a client and give them a demo and get their feedback. They could say, you know what, we want these other columns in the view. We want the form to look a little bit different. And it's a good proof of concept as you're building the apps with your end stakeholders, the people that will be using this, to quickly build a full-fledged application. And then not only that, there are a lot of extra features that are part of this as well. We could build charts. So I could extend this a little bit further with the chart. So I'm going to expand this. So I have this bar chart that I've already broken down the number of classes by course. And of course, I could build some more advanced charts as well. If these charts aren't good enough and maybe you need something a lot more complex, then you can kind of bring in Power BI and embed this as well. So I could probably talk about model-driven apps for another hour or two, but we want to stay track on time. Let's now take a look at Canvas apps. And Canvas apps are a little bit different. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so there's a question, how to remove a permission feature like delete of a table. Absolutely. So what you would do is a couple different ways. Typically, I would go into the Power Platform Admin Center. So I would go a couple different ways I could do that. I could just go in this, well, actually I'm in the app itself. I would go into Make. I would go into the Admin Center. Now I am going to be going a few little clicks here, but let's go into the environment when it comes up. Let's go into WebAge. Looks like WebAge test got created successfully, which is good, but I wanted just to show the environment creation. And the other thing is actually security roles can also be solution aware. So what I would probably do, as opposed to, this is one way I can edit the security role once it's already been deployed. I would go into the admin center, not here, I would go into settings rather. We have a section here for users and permissions. I have security roles. And let's just look at basic user. And you can create your own security roles. You have the full capability to do that. I want to edit the security role. Now, this is something that, again, I also want to point out. If you go to a certain screen, sometimes it looks a little weird, to say the least. This is because some of these screens are still utilizing the older user interface. They haven't completely converted everything over to the new user interface. They are working on it. So that's why some of these screens look a little 2013-ish. But anyways, I'm this security role for the basic user. I would go to custom entities, which mean custom tables. And I would find, for instance, my class. So here is the class entity. And we have these little dots here. And I could begin to add and remove. So in this case, the basic user does not have access already, but I can do different things. The privileges at the top here, the create, the read, the write. Delete is what I would basically clear out for all my custom tables. They could still deactivate it if we give them that access, but they can't delete it. So hopefully that kind of shows you where that's done. And then what I would typically do for an app, I would create my own custom security role. And then within the solution itself, you can actually make security role solution aware, meaning if you're taking the solution, moving it from your development environment into your test or from your development into your production, you'd be able to move that custom security role as well. So I don't believe I have a security role set up in here. Let me just load this. I need to go back into the solution anyway to look at the Canvas app, but basically we should have the ability to, so if I want to go add, I probably would go, yeah, under security, I would add an existing security role and add that into my solution with all the, so basic user, let's just add that into the solution. So those changes, you only have to make the changes in one spot, so you don't have to go to each environment and go crazy with those dots. All right, so let's talk about Canvas apps. So I'm gonna go back into my apps, and from here, this is where, when we talk Power Apps, this is sort of what a lot of people think when they think Power Apps is Canvas apps. So I could go and I can create a brand new app from Canvas. I can choose a phone form factor or a tablet form factor. I've already created an app here called the registration app. And what this, with the thing is with Canvas-based Power Apps, is we have much more control over how they look and feel, but we have to do a lot of that extra work to do all those buttons. Now, there are templates that are involved that can really speed up the development of this as one way, but it really helps with the development. So let me just get this up and running. And as this is coming up, one thing I like about Canvas apps is when you saw the model-driven app, and I know a lot of people look at this and they're like, whoa, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of buttons here. There's a lot of navigation. I have to drill down. And if I drill down here, I kind of get lost where I am. And you're right, a lot of new users would see that. Although once they're into it just for a few hours, then they get the hang of it, where to find things and do that functionality. But this is kind of sometimes looking like if someone just handed me the keys to a jumbo jet and say, hey, take it for a fly it around for an hour, I wouldn't even know where to start without a little bit of direction. And that might not be the best case. Maybe you have users that there's high turnover in your users. You want to have them do a very specific thing. This is where Canvas apps are a good option. So I'm here and I'm in my Canvas app designer. I'll try to expand this a little bit. So we start out with, okay, a question about portal apps. I'll get to portal apps in probably about 10 minutes or so, and I'll cover that as well. So here I have the Canvas app, and from here I can add different screens. So I usually start with a blank screen, and if I wanted to, I could add a brand new screen. It could be blank, it could be scrollable. Let's just add a new blank screen. And then from here, I can begin to add things. So maybe I wanted to add something like a button. I can add a button to the screen, and I could position that anywhere I wanted to position it. And then to make that do something, I would actually have a formula that I would write in there. Let's do something else. I want to show some data. So I'm going to add a gallery, and I'll just add a vertical gallery. And what that will do, we'll put that gallery on my form here. And here is where I can have this link to data. Now, this data can be anything. It could be an Excel sheet, it could be a SharePoint list, but what I want it to do is point to an actual Dataverse table. So I already have in my registration, in my app, I have it pointed to some Dataverse tables. So let's just see if I can have a list of all the classes on this particular gallery. And I've linked that. So I now see the classes. It's just showing the dates. That's not really helpful. So what I'll do is I'll go to this component, and instead of the start date and time, I actually want it to show the class title. So I would go in and begin to work with, and this is, like I said, called Power Effects now, this formula language. And now that I've done this, I now see the name of my particular class. And here I could click on this arrow to drill down in some details and really begin to design this Canvas app exactly how I want it. So if I now go, I basically on this app itself, I had originally a way to do registrations. I have some other things here to refresh, to do sorting. And once I've done adding all my icons and all of my features and functionality to this particular app, I want to run it. I can just run it in the thing here, or I could deploy it and install the Power Apps app on my iPhone and run it from there. So I actually have some Power Apps on my phone that I use to, update things like my timesheets and things like that that I've created. So here I can go and quickly add a new record. I'm going to add, I want to register for a class. I'm going to choose that class. Here's the student I want to choose. Here's the registration date. Let's pick the registration for today. Click OK. And for the status reason, I'm just going to put pending at this point. So I've filled in these fields. I'm clicking this check mark. It's tied to the form submit on this app, and it's now added this directly to Dataverse registration 1002. If I were to go back into my model-driven app they were just looked at registrations, here's registration 1002. So this is the idea with overall building a business solution is you don't have to choose a Canvas or a model-driven app. You could have a mix and match of different apps in your overall business solution depending on the end user that's going to be consuming that particular app. So here we have the model-driven app, good for administration, for managing that data. Here we have this Canvas app, which is good for a very specific function, that function of doing a class registration. And I mean, I could have done it from the model-driven app as well. I can go in here and create a brand new registration and fill out the form and all of this, all of those details. But instead, I thought, you know what, I'm not the one doing the registration, someone else is. We could utilize that in the Canvas app. So really, there's multiple ways to do something. So the question is about external facing. I'm going to talk about portals next, but this is something that a lot of people kind of get surprised about. Canvas apps and model-driven apps are geared toward internal users only, so people that actually have a license. I can't go and create a Canvas app and create the next version of Tetris or Bejeweled or something within a Canvas app and then sell that on an app store as an external app. Microsoft doesn't allow that through its licensing. So what the answer is, in order to give people access to external information, is to publish this through a Power Apps portal. So I'm going to dive into portals next. I know this is a very quick demo of Canvas apps. And again, Canvas apps is something I could probably talk about all day long. But here we can, begin to add different forms and controls and media and charts tied into AI Builder and do a lot of cool stuff. But now what I want to do is sort of the next step is to build this out to give us access to a portal. So this portals work a little bit differently than Canvas apps and model-driven apps in terms of if I wanted to create a brand new app, model-driven or Canvas app, I would typically do that within a solution and I could create a Canvas app from blank, or I could create a model-driven app from blank. Like I said, I would build usually those in a solution so I could transport that. If I chose portal from blank, what this does, it creates a new portal. Now I've already provisioned a portal. It takes about 40 minutes, so I'm not going to kick this off here. That's why it's telling me something went wrong. But I would go through this process. It would provision the portal. And what that would do is a couple things. It would install a lot of the portal metadata. The portal metadata is what describes the portal, its structure. It also creates some management tools and some administration tools. And it also creates, it actually provisions a fully functional portal. So if I click on this particular portal itself, this is what comes with. So it actually, as opposed to the Canvas app and the model-driven app where you basically start from blank and need to add the components, portals actually can start with a fully functional web application. You see that there's a sign-in, there's some pages that are already been set up, some static content here. Now we can change the layout, the look and feel. You can add your own custom CSS to this and make it look and feel, match your branding. That really goes on. I do teach a course on portals. It's like a full day course, but let's just show you the basics. So within my maker portal here, I can go into edit. And this is going to launch something called the Portal Studio. So each Power App has its own method to design it. Remember, in the model driven, we had the form designer and the view designer and the app designer. Canvas app, we had that Canvas app studio where we're able to drag and drop things. Now we're in the portal designer. And what it provides is a sort of what you see is what you get designer for building portals. So I can go in here and begin to design. Welcome to portals, or welcome to, I could say, low code, no code session. And basically it's just, I can begin to design my portal pages this way. What I can also do is I'm going to add a brand new web page. So I'm going to do this, and then I'm just going to choose an existing template. There are a series of different templates and layouts. In a much more advanced session, I can show you how to build your own custom web templates, so you can have your own different layouts and things like that. Goes well beyond the scope of what we can do today, but I just wanted to, we can go with the default templates. So I have this new page, and let's say I wanted to, I'm just going to say, call this my page. And this has an auto save, which is a little bit annoying, but it is what it is. And I'm just going to let that, so let's put the new title there. I'm just going to type my page. And here I can begin to add different components. So I'm just going to remove this default text. I'm going to go here to what they call is the tool belt. I'm going to add a component, and I'm going to add a 2-column section. And in that 2-column section, first I'll add some text. And I'll just kind of type in something here like, let's just do hello world. And then in the other section, maybe I want to add an image. So I can go in components, add an image component, and I can pick an image that exists out of the box, or I could upload an image as well. So I've added this. I'm just going to decrease the resolution just a touch. So you can actually see what this page looks like. And now I can go quick browse on my website. And this is a fully externally available web page that's kind of viewable around the world. And just give that a second to load it because I've just made the configurations. So there it is. Pretty simple. And I know if I show that to people the first time they're looking at it, they're going, yeah, that's cool, but I can do that in WordPress just as easily, or I could even do that in Notepad and create HTML or any other content management system. And you're absolutely right, you totally can. But what you can do in Power Apps portals is I'm going back to the editor here. I'm going to go in this section. I'm going to add another one column section here. And in this particular section, I'm going to go to my components, and I have things called a form or a list. I'm going to choose the list, and I'm going to call this class list. And then I can pick my Dataverse table. So this is going to go through my entire list of Dataverse tables for this particular environment. And scroll down a little bit. So here's class. And remember, we created a bunch of those model-driven views. I can choose to view different views or multiple views. I want to choose active classes and maybe inactive classes. And I'll just don't worry about this, but we could drill down to the different things. I could set permissions and other settings, but I've added this, and now I'm going to go back and browse to my website, and I'm just going to make sure it saves. It does have an auto save here, and browse, and I'm going back to my portal. And you'll notice already it's beginning to show those column headings. And I'm here, it's refreshing. So now I actually have a list of all of those classes, but these are now surfaced on a portal page. Think about that for a minute. If you needed to build a web application that talked to Dataverse or even to Azure SQL or any other database, you would have to use Visual Studio. You would have to create an ASPX page. You'd have to figure out the SDK or the web API to retrieve the data. Once you retrieve the data, you'd have to figure out a table structure to format it. Then you would actually have to take that web application, spin up an Azure web app, upload those ASPX pages to that web app, make sure your security, your connection string was all set up or your authentication was all set up. So you'd be looking at least a couple hours, which effectively took me probably 5 minutes to surface data. And that's just because this is where the Power Apps portals come into play. Now, in terms of mobile devices, this is just on a big web page. This is utilizing, it's still utilizing an older version of Bootstrap. It's Bootstrap 3. However, I know they're trying to figure out a strategy to transition to newer web technologies for that backend structure. But if I were to view this on a mobile phone, so if I begin to shrink this down and put it like into a tablet, we see that it is refactoring, it is resizing. So you can make sort of, I guess, web applications for external users using portals, and it will factor to the different kind of layouts and things like that. And I know that Microsoft has a few more tricks up their sleeve that eventually will be coming around using portals and web applications as well for externally based users. So, so just kind of to quickly recap what we talked about, and again, I'm only scratching the surface on some of these things, but in the past hour or just a little bit over an hour, what we've done is we've taken the data model from these different tables. From that, we created a bunch of tables. Well, I created them earlier, but we've gone through and created those tables. We also created the different views. We've created the forms. We took those views and forms and put those into our app designer. And then from that, we're able to publish this. We could have taken some other things like charts and those business rules and a lot of other things. And then we're able to make an app out of that. We also built a Canvas app, or saw one that was built, where we had some controls that were already talking to Dataverse, where we have that Canvas app, again, talking to that common place where the information is. And then also from provisioning a portal, we're able to go through and build out a portal that talked to Dataverse, covering those 3 different types of Power Apps. So the question came from a little bit more of describing the differences between Canvas apps and why would we use one or the other. That came from Bevan. So again, this is always going to be, this might be one of those ongoing debates of which is the best way. But here is sort of high level some of those differences. And someone else asked me this the other day when I was doing some training, and I put together this slide. So on a canvas, you have that full pixel control the user interface. So a canvas app is good for if it's a user interface type of thing, where we don't want to do a lot of training. We want to have a big, easy buttons, user click here, do this, do that. So very task-based. The other benefit of Canvas apps is you have multiple connectors and data sources. So I can link to a SharePoint list. I can link to Dataverse. I can link to Microsoft To Do, or I could dump stuff into Microsoft Teams. So I can do multiple connectors on that Canvas app. It has a lot of those built-in functions. It has a lot of those controls. We just like added a button and a gallery, but there's dozens more. And we can embed that we can actually embed that Canvas app in a model-driven app or even on a Power BI dashboard. Model-driven, the back end is always Dataverse. But you can extend that further with virtual tables. This is a newer concept, but for the most part, your model-driven app is always Dataverse. The benefit I find is it always has the same app layout and navigation. So like I said, once you've worked with one model-driven app, you've worked with them all. So this way, an end user, if you have multiple apps, and I have customers that have multiple applications, they actually can easily navigate because all the apps look the same. They have the same functionality. So you have things like that built-in menuing and those features like the export to Excel and all that. I didn't have to do any configuration for that. I didn't have to do any extra programming or any development. It was just there as part of the app. And as you saw, you can develop that app very rapidly. You could do a proof of concept, you can build it out quickly, show it to your users. If they like it, great, you can make adjustments. It is auto-responsive, something I didn't show you, but it also shrinks down to fit on mobile devices as well if you're operating it from there. And with model-driven, you can do configurable offline access. That's a whole other bunch of steps, but I don't have to go through any kind of development. The offline access is there through configuration. So at the end of the day, the answer is it depends on what the end users are doing. But also, like I showed you, you can have model-driven apps for certain workloads or do Canvas for other workloads. I actually like to use a combination of both in my projects. Really depends on what the individual users need. So I hope that helps kind of explain some of that information. Cool. All right, so I'm going to move on. We're going to talk about Power Automate. And so through, and I just a quick little answer on for Umesh asking about your VB app. You said it's SQL or DB2. So yeah, you could build, I think you can get a connector for SQL or DB2. If it's an on-premise SQL, you have to use a gateway, and that's a whole other conversation. But you could build a Canvas app. To build a model-driven app is probably a lot more complex unless you do a data migration to Dataverse. But hopefully I've given you a little bit of the seeds here to get thinking about that. So let's go back to my deck here. And again, like the Power Apps, I'm not going to spend a ton of time in PowerPoint. I'm very much, I'd rather show people stuff than talk about it. So what will Power Automate do? It really has the ability to automate a lot of repetitive tasks. So to kind of go through, do the same thing over and over again. So you're not always clicking or you're not always recopying, pasting data. It allows you to guide a user through a process. You can connect to different data sources. You can also automate desktop processes. You might not know of this. I don't talk about, I will be showing you today strictly cloud flows, but if you didn't know, there is something called Power Automate Desktop. Power Automate Desktop is a way to automate a lot of things on your desktop. That's now included as part of Windows 10 for free. Microsoft announced this a few weeks ago, so definitely check that out if you get a chance. But today we're just going to be talking about cloud flows that are part of the Power Platform. So a couple of other things we could do here is there's a lot of pre-built templates. So we don't always have to start from scratch. We can use a template to automate a lot of your applications and things of that sort. Again, we talked about those connectors. There's 300 connectors that we can use in Canvas apps. We can use those same 300 connectors in our Power Automate that we can talk to a whole bunch of different services. And I'll actually show you some of that when I'm getting into the demo. And if there isn't a connector, as long as there's a REST API of some sort, you could either do a webhook. There are HTTP posts and GET functions within Power Automate, or you can create a custom connector. So an example I give quite frequently is I worked on a project, and the person I was doing the project for, they like to use a service called Toggle to track their time. I built my own system using Power Apps to do my own timesheets, so I didn't want to do double entry. So what I did was I looked for a connector for Toggle. One didn't exist, but it did have a REST API, so I was able to build a custom connector. So every time I entered data into my own timesheet app using a Canvas app, that saved to Dataverse, and then it kicked off the flow, which pushed that data into the Toggle system. So again, I was only entering data once. I didn't have to rekey. There was no cut and paste errors. Everything was reconciled in terms of the hours and the billable rates and everything because I had used a connector for that. We also can integrate fully within the Microsoft ecosystem. So I can integrate with Azure, with Office 365, and of course with Dynamics 365 as well. We can access on-premise using the gateway services. I've heard varying degrees of success with the on-premise gateways. Some people had got it working, it was no problem. Other systems that were a little bit sluggish to begin with, some dated systems, had a few more issues, but you can connect different things both on-premise and the cloud. So I'm going to build a few different demos today. Start out very simple and kind of go a little bit more complex. So basically, we're going to use the build a flow to get the weather. I want to build an approval process, and then maybe I'll also do something on a timer that's going to schedule something. So let's pop out of this. I'm going to go pop back into my environment. I did paste some links in the chat window, so hopefully, I know that some people are asking where's some learning materials. I always direct people to start with, go to Microsoft Learn, it's free. You can get little badges and points to go deeper into this stuff and try this stuff out for yourself. And of course, WebH has courses as well. And so let's go into, I know I have a ton of tabs open here. So let me just open up another tab and close down some of these things. I'm going to leave. Yes. And I also put the link to the GitHub as well. And also I'm going to make sure that you guys fill in your surveys at the end. So just bear with me 2 seconds. That's my portal. So I just actually want to go back into make that preview, powerapps.com. Give this a second to warm up. It is the cloud. And again, I can go and begin to create the flows directly through. I can go to flow.microsoft.com. However, again, because I go to my WebAge environment, because I like to kind of keep things in a package that I can transfer later using ALM processes, I do like to keep things in solutions. So I'm just going to find my classroom app solution that I created earlier. And I do have a section in here for cloud flows. Here. And I have some I think I've created already, but let's create one completely from scratch. So I'm going to create a new cloud flow. And we want this to be, I'm going to make this instant. So there's different flows here. So this is a flow that I'm going to trigger on its own. Now, when this comes up, we can actually build from templates. So I don't actually always have to build everything from scratch. So I can choose some of my launching points here. I'm going to skip that. And a flow always needs a trigger. Now, that trigger can be something that you do, or something that happens on a schedule, or something that happens in a system, like a record gets updated or a field gets updated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose manually trigger a flow. But we see here we have a whole bunch of other options, and literally hundreds and different connectors. And when I trigger this flow, I'm going to want to give it an input. So here I'm going to actually ask for text. What I want to do is I want to create a flow that's going to give me the weather for today. So in order to get the weather from a service, I'm going to need to tell it my location. Where am I asking about the weather? So I'm going to type in postal code, and I'm just going to put in a thing here, say, please enter your postal code. So this is going to be my trigger. It's going to add that postal code. That's great. That's my trigger. That's what's starting my Power Automate flow. The next step, this is where I want it to go out to a different connector. So we have tons of connectors here. So if I take a look at weather and do a search, I have MSN weather. That's great. I'm going to use this connector. So I'm going to choose MSN weather. And what are my actions? So my action is I want to get what's the current weather? That's what I want to retrieve. And so it's going to want to know the location. So how am I going to feed it in the location? Now remember, I asked for it in this trigger step. This is what we call an action step. So in my action, I can use some dynamic content. So here I can find the postal code. So I'm just going to do a search. And here's that postal code. It's got another one from before. Oh, I've added the postal code here. And I'm from Canada, and I think many of you might be Canadian. We're going to do metric. So we're going to get this in the proper way to get weather. Apologize for my American friends. But anyways, so we're going to get that weather. So what this is going to use, this connector, it's going to go to an external service to MSN Weather, and it's going to retrieve the weather for this postal code. So now that I got it, I want to do something with it. So I want it to send me an email. So my next step is I want to link into, now I could have it send an email here. So let's do that. I'm just going to send an email notification. And this is going to send it from a Microsoft email address, which is fine for this particular example. And I'm just going to hard code for now. I could do a dynamic as well, but I'm going to hard code in my email address. I'm going to put in the subject line, the weather is the weather today. And in the content of my email, I can sort of say the different things. So here is the weather, and I have the different dynamic content. These are the things that are going to be pushed back from the MSN weather connector. So I have the conditions, and maybe I also want to see temperature units, UV index. Yeah, I'm curious in the UV index as well. So I can say here are the conditions, and let's just say UV index, what it currently is right now. So I have this. So now that I've done this particular flow, I'm going to save this. And obviously I want to give it a name as opposed to untitled. So it's just saving this flow into the cloud. So yeah, it's given me a default name. I want to change this. Basically, send me the weather. It's the name of my flow, and I'm going to save it. And I have a flow checker. The Power Platform has checkers all over the place to check different things. And now we can actually test it directly from this interface. So what I'm going to do is do this automatically because it is, or sorry, manually. And I'm just going to save and test. Now, because it's asking me for a prompt, there's different ways I could get that prompt. First off, it's going to want to sign in to mail, make sure it's authenticated. For certain things like Dataverse, it's important. So here's postal code. Actually, does someone want to throw in a Canadian postal code where they live in the chat window or in the question window, and I'll use that. Any volunteers? Because I know what the weather's like at home. Oh, okay, cool. We got a few for Bevan, so I'll just grab yours. R325X2, and we'll just put this in here. Let's see what the weather's like. So we're running this flow now. It's going through the process, and you can actually see that this worked. The trigger worked, the get current weather worked, and I can expand this and see the information kind of being sent back. And it's sending me the email notification. So I'm going to go to my Outlook where I have the get weather today. And it says partly sunny, UV index moderate. So Bevan, I hope you're enjoying your partly sunny weather today. But that's just a very simple Power Automate flow that will actually just went out to a third-party service or not actually a third party, but MSN, and got the weather and sent it back. And you can create a lot of different flows to do different things like that. So one actually, for those of you, you might have heard of the Twitter account, the Canadian, the vaccine distribution. It's a Twitter account where they're saying where there's vaccine availability for the COVID vaccine, because a lot of different pharmacies and different options are kind of popping up and different things, and people are having a hard time to navigate it. I actually wrote a flow that would actually monitor that Twitter account, and every time that there was one in my area, it sends me an email to let me know what's going on. So that was just sort of kind of another personal use of cloud flows. So that is an example of what we call an instant flow. And what we can do is we can load a flow app on our phone, and then from the flow app, I can press a button and feed it the postal code and get the weather sent to me. I could also tie into other things, like if I wanted to shut down a server in Azure, whether I wanted to do some ALM processing, a lot of different things, I could press a button. We could also do geolocation, meaning if soon as I drive up to my house, I could actually trigger a flow that does stuff like turns on the lights, unlocks my garage, do all these things automatically for me. Like, it's kind of the epitome of laziness, but it's just kind of neat tech that you can do with flow. So let's look at another flow that's an approval flow, because this is something from a business standpoint is very effective. So if we go back and remember our classroom Canvas app, or not Canvas app, our model-driven app, I wanted to build an approval process. Now, we talked about automation within Dataverse that currently exists, but we can use Power Automate to do a lot of that automation as well. So if I go into, I should have left this open from earlier. I need to change my environment here and go to the web page one. Let's go into the classroom app. And I want to trigger every time a class is pending to go through an approval process to add it to the schedule. So I'm just going to load up my classroom model-driven app that we had from earlier. And every time I want to be an automation where if we create a class that's set as pending, I want that to go through an approval process. So how would we do that? I would go into, once again, into Flow. Let's look at this one, and I did create this earlier. And again, just want to make sure that we have time to show everything and answer any questions. So here I have Flow, and I'm going to go into the editor. And this time the trigger, when it shows up, the trigger is based on something that happened. So the trigger is using the Dataverse connector, and the change type was create. So this is, like I mentioned, every flow needs a trigger. So this time I'm not pressing a button. Something is happening. We're monitoring something. So every time a class record gets created, and we have some more options here, where the status code, and this is using the schema name, is equal to, and this is the option set for pending. So every time a class gets created that set as pending, I want to go through an approval process. So that's my trigger. The next step here, it's going to start and wait for an approval. This is another thing with Power Automate, we can do approvals. So it's basically saying, here's the approval type, we're going to approve or reject. Here's the title. Again, I'm sending it to myself, to my email address, and it's going to basically fill in some dynamic content. Please approve the following class, the class name, the start date. Now, based on my approval, which is going to show up in my email, we have another condition here. And if the outcome equals approve, that's a yes. And then it's going to change the class status here. It's going to update that record in Dataverse to scheduled. If I decide no, what's going to happen is it's going to change it to canceled. So that's my workflow. So let's see this in action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my classroom app. I'm going to go into classes, and I'm going to create a brand new class. And again, this is model-driven apps, and it, like I said, doesn't take me long to create. Here's the form. I want to pick the course. And this is really weird. The pop-up are doing some weird things on me today. But anyways, the status reason equals pending. And I want the start time to be, let's say we're going to start on Saturday at 8 a.m. and we're also going to finish on Saturday at, let's say 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So I've added this information. I'm now going to save this record in my model-driven app. And remember, this was set as pending. So what's happening now is that should trigger my approval flow. And if we go back here and I go back to, oops, I want to go back to here. And again, we don't have to do anything. This is running in the background. We see here that it's running. And notice in my Teams, it showed me an approval. And also in my mailbox, I have this approval showing up. And this is directly in my email. Now, this is just going to me, but this could go to a manager or to some, some executive or something, somebody, who's maybe not smart enough to use a computer, but they can use their phone. And then they can go in here and they can say, oh, here's the class AI Builder for Beginner. It's happening on Saturday. They can either approve or reject it. So they click approve. They can even put in comments, sure, no problem, and then hit submit. So now they've approved that class. So that's going to continue to run. This has now been approved. And we see that the final status is approved in Teams for some reason. If I now go back to this record and I just do a refresh, drum roll please, notice it now says scheduled, and that was all automatic because Flow did that automation for me. And if I look at my status here and I just do a refresh, we can actually go back in time and see what happened. So this was succeeded I can click on this and I can see the steps that it went through. So we got a check mark here. So here was the approval, and the response was in the condition, the response was equal to true. So that's why I went down the yes. Now, sometimes what happens is you might get an error. You might run into something. You might not have the results you want. Yeah, so the question is, could you add a third condition or action item if yes or no? Yeah, we could. So instead of using on the condition statement here, I'll go back into edit. It's a great question. We can also do switch case. So I'll add a new step, and under control, I think switch. So here's the switch control. So I could put if case equals yes, or no, or maybe from that can kind of spread off into different threads or forms. So hopefully, Oscar, that answers your question. But what I was going to say, as I develop this, what I can do is with the test, yeah, I have to fix that now, but actually the flow checker. So I'll just, I'll get rid of this completely now. And then under my test, I can actually go through and use data that ran before, so whether it failed or not. So I don't need to always go back into my application and re-trigger that whole process to run again. I can kind of go back. And so for testing and debugging, this is really fantastic, saves a ton of time to go through all of these different steps and flows. So far, this has been a pretty simple, I wouldn't say simple flow, but we have the condition here. As you can tell, these things can get unruly real fast with the different branches and different threads. We can break these out and begin to launch child flows or have other flows triggered by other things. So typically what I do, as opposed to building one massive flow, I'll begin to kind of boil it down and have different flows to run for different stages of the game and for different things to make it a little bit more manageable. So, that is, so that's the flow that gets triggered when something happens. The last flow that I'm going to show you today is something that's going to run on a schedule. And I find this very handy, especially in writing business applications. Sometimes we're not always going into our business app to look at a dashboard or to check data. It's good to get a summary of information on a regular basis, kind of automatically. So here I have a flow that I've called classes this week. And what this flow does is I have it set that it's going to run once a week. And once a week, it's going to show me all the classes that are happening this month. So I'm going to go into my edit to show you how that works. So my trigger, and like I said, remember every flow needs a trigger. This is on a schedule and it's going to run once a week, every week. And I can change the interval so I could have this run every day, once a month. We could have it run every second, but I wouldn't recommend that because you do have an allocation of flows with your license, but you don't want to use up all your flows either. I know people that have run into that where they have a message that they've used up all their flows. But here I'm going to just leave that as run that once a week. I can also specify what days I want to run it, what the start time is, a little bit more configurable. I'm not going to worry about that now. So that's my trigger. My next step is my action. Again, I'm going to use the common data service action here. And what I'm doing is I'm doing a query, I'm doing a get, I'm trying to get a bunch of data. So I'm going to choose classes. And then I can put in some filtering because I don't want to necessarily get all the classes. I just want the classes that are happening this month. So I have this OData structure in here, and this looks a little bit complicated as it is, and I would never be able to remember how to type this properly. I could use the OData here, or I could use something called Fetch XML. Thankfully, there's tools out there that help us kind of do this querying, there's a tools called the XRM Toolbox. And if you've not heard of the XRM Toolbox and you're working with Dataverse or even Dynamics CRM or 365, definitely find that. I'll put it in the chat window as well. It is a absolute lifesaver for working with the Power Platform. So you can find that tool and download it there. It is like a desktop tool, but here there's something called the Fetch XML Builder. I was able to connect to my Dataverse from here. I can find my particular table, my class table, and begin to build out through this user interface my structure. And then I can execute it. And it shows me the list of those records, which is great. I have this Fetch XML, which I could use to paste that directly into Power Automate, or I could go through the Power Automate parameters and get my OData structure and a few other things as well. So again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this tool, but to me, that's just sort of how I figured that out as opposed to trying to think about it by doing it by hand. So I've I've added the filter rows here. So I have this, it's going to retrieve all the classes this week. All right. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to send that to an email, but I want to send it in a table. Well, thankfully, there is another action to create an HTML table. So from this HTML table action, I want to take my values of what I've retrieved from my classes, and I want to begin to fill out my table. So here's the header, here's the start date, and here's the number of registrations so far. Maybe I'm curious to know that. This is my HTML table, and I can just go and embed that in an email and send that off. So here I created this email, said here are the classes this month, here are the outputs from this. However, I want to make that table a little bit more pretty because it looks pretty ugly. And this is where I just actually dumped in a little bit of CSS styling. There's another MVP, Ryan McLean out of Scotland, who wrote a blog article on how to do this. So that just makes my table look a little bit nicer when it gets into my email. So now that I've done that, we don't have to wait around a week for this flow to run. I'm going to trigger it in my testing just so you see how it works. But typically this would just run on its own. I'm going to hit test. I'm going to run this, actually I'll run this manually. And what this will do, it will trigger off that flow as if this was running once a week. And it's kicked off here. I'm going to run the flow. There's no parameters or anything, and it's successfully started, so I'll just hit done. And you heard that email chime, and we can see here that it's gone through all the steps, and it ran pretty quickly. One thing I find about Flow, it does run pretty fast. And if I go in and look at my email, I do see the classes this month. And I do see here's the class, here are the 3 that are running this month. Here's the start date. I probably would have formatted that date a little bit nicely, and it doesn't look like we have any registration so far. Again, this is just sample data that I created here, but this is something that I utilize a lot. A lot of the projects I work on, the clients are always wanting summaries. Like I mentioned before, I created a timesheet app using Power Apps and Dataverse. Instead of me writing up a full summary every week, I actually have Flow do it for me. It goes, looks at all my timesheets, it compiles the information for each project, sends me an email with a digest like this, and I can just send it off to my clients, and they're happy, they know what's going on. I'm happy because it doesn't take me any time to do, and it's just all using the power of Power Automate. So I know I've talked to you guys for a good almost 3 hours straight now. And I was able to show you a lot of stuff with Dataverse. We talked about Power Apps, the model-driven app, the Canvas app, the portals. We also talked about Power Automate. We looked at a flow that was triggered by kind of a push button, a flow that was triggered based on an action, something happening in my Dataverse, and also a flow that kind of ran on a schedule. So that pretty much wraps up this presentation. Before I let you guys go, of course, I'm going to have questions as well. There is evaluations, so please fill out the valuation here. So I'm doing my part. So definitely please fill out the evaluation so we know that this was valuable for you guys. I think that link showed up there. Yes, let me send that. Cool. So hopefully you got that link. Definitely fill out the evaluation. Let us know what you thought. I hope that you guys, and I will get this deck posted as well, so you guys be able to have that reference to go back to it. And I believe this webinar is being recorded, so I'm guessing it's going to be posted somewhere. I don't know for sure. But cool. So before I go and let you get on with your day, was there any other questions about what we covered today, whether with Flow or Dataverse or Power Apps, that we can just wrap up in the next few minutes? Nothing else for questions. I'll give you back the rest of your an extra 12 minutes, and definitely hope you learned a lot. And definitely just try this stuff out. You get signed up for a community plan. Go to MS Learn. Believe me, this is how I learn. I got to try stuff out and make mistakes. And if you're on a community plan environment, if you make a few mistakes, it's fine. There's also the Power Platform community as well, to ask questions. There's a lot of helpful people who'll be more than happy to help you out, point you in the right direction. And if you even can get your company to build a project on the Power Platform, believe me, best way to learn for sure.